Um, yeah, so Katie told me that I guess the theme of these is to talk about like the transition from academia to as a student to like full-time artist or working artist or whatever. Um, I feel like I actually never really put the art down while I was a student. I just found other ways to do it. So, um, I mean, like now wood was something that I did have to put down because like when I did pick it up originally, it was in high school. And so I couldn't really afford like woodworking materials as a 14-year-old, 15-year-old, just like my parents' garage, like, hey, I need another table saw. But so that wasn't really a thing. So I put down, like I wanted to do wood, and I did like instrument building in high school, and I did set design and set making for like the plays in school, but didn't have like, afterwards, like I wanted to continue, but couldn't because, it's a lot to do wood stuff. And so I kind of put it down like when I was 17, that was it for me. But I still was doing performance, and I still was making clothes and making accessories and making random things like this thing. And I did all types of other stuff in between. So my undergraduate degree is in anthropology, and with a focus on like archival ethnography, like from like a cultural anthropology perspective. So I was doing a lot of like rebuilding of people's life stories and rebuilding of things like the stories behind artifacts, kind of like within like museum settings, within like special collections at different places like Bryn Mawr, Haverford College, the Penn Museum, just like looking through their archival materials, doing things like that. And so while I was still in undergrad, I put together an exhibition that was, it was all like African artifacts, all African cultural objects, but it was also, it also looked at who the people were that donated these things and what their motives were for donating the things. So not only were the objects on display, but I also made panels that put the collectors on display as well, and put their history, and put some of their writing and some of their thoughts and their opinions on display as well. Additionally, I put on display how under-researched a lot of things that aren't European art are treated. So at the time I was at Bryn Mawr College, and I was working on my thesis, my undergraduate thesis in anthropology, and focusing on one collector in particular and her contributions to not just Bryn Mawr College, but to the entire city of Philadelphia and the greater Philadelphia region within African art. And but also looking at how she, or not just her, but a lot of collectors of African art, they tend not to talk about who the artists are behind the work, or they tend not to take good notes on where they got it, what the exact day and year was, the region, the language that was spoken, the people, who the maker was, or what school of making it comes from, right? Like a lot of us know what surrealism is, and we know what cubism is, and we know all these other things, and we know who the artists are in those particular genres that come out of like European art styles. But when it comes to art styles that fall outside of Europe, we tend not to know who the maker is. We tend not to know what year it was made. We know like an approximation, right? Like, oh, well, during this time, this is when, colonization was taking place in this country. So it probably is between this 13-year span. And so we'll see like labels that have that 13-year span, but not like the exact year that it was made, who made it, and so the information behind it tends to be cataloged very differently, if it's cataloged at all. And so I thought about that a lot. I thought about that a lot with the work. And so when I did my final thesis, I also did a thesis exhibition, which was funded through my Mellon Mays undergraduate fellowship. And people were like, oh, I never knew. Oh, I didn't know. Oh, this is, like it wasn't just the exhibition, but it was also like we put questions. We had like vinyl words printed out and put onto the glass cases of like, so you'd be trying to look at something and instead you're looking directly at this question that's right in front of what would be, like whose collection is this, or who matters when we look at this, and giving the audience the opportunity to think a little more about how we frame exhibitions around the art of marginalized populations. So after the show, like a lot of people were like, wow, that really made me think. And then there was one woman, and African-American woman, and she was very upset. And she was, she had tears in her eyes, and she was a elderly African-American woman, and she looked at me and she was like, why didn't they do this? She was like, why would they do that? And I didn't have an answer for her. I was just like, they didn't do it. Like, I don't know what to tell you. No, they didn't do the research. They didn't put it in there. She was like, well, they had the funding. And I was like, oh, yeah. yeah. But I thought a lot about how she felt, because she was like, technically, not technically, but the story behind the way a lot of objects from colonial spaces are obtained is also the story behind how a lot of colonial, like people were obtained during colonial times as well. And so in the story of these things being under-researched and underfunded and mistreated and not properly stored, she also saw her own personal human history of being African American in the United States and having a history that's also like not properly stored or recorded, and being part of a people that was deeply mistreated for like very, very long time. And so it connected with her in a different way, but it also made me think about my choices as a person who could curate something and put something together for people and put it on display. And it was kind of a wake-up call for me, because like in my mind, I was like, well, people need to know that there isn't enough research going into these types of things. But then I thought about just kind of the moments of like autoethnography, right? Where you're just standing there and you're like, this isn't just about the thing over there, right? Like, I'm not like an armchair anthropologist, like, oh, I'm sitting here observing somebody all the way over there. But it's also like, it's a personal story, right? And so it's like you're telling part of your own lived experience too, but that lived experience, if you share cultural heritage with someone else, is also going to be their story too. And so whereas for me, it was like a moment of empowerment where I was like, I get to do the research behind these things and bring out things that people didn't even know was back here. I thought about this woman, and I thought about how upset she was when she was leaving the exhibition space. And I was like, it's not just my responsibility for me to enjoy the fact that I like research, the fact that I love digging into archival spaces and library things and special collections and books and all types of things, but it's also my responsibility to make sure that people don't leave harmed, and that they don't leave hurt, and they don't leave crying because they see themselves, and it brings up things that are really painful. And so after that, I kind of made like a personal commitment to joy, like this idea of joy embodied in my work, and not just like in my curatorial work and my archival work, but also like in my art practice and my performance practice. So like most of my performance art and also like my visual art also kind of, it has like this like levity to it and this absurdity to it, which brings it outside of like kind of how we expect good work to be. We have like this idea that good work comes from like this very strict space, and it has to be like amazing, and we have to be like, oh, my life is completely changed because it's amazing. But sometimes you can have the skill to make something amazing and choose not to. And it's like, and so what do you do with that? And how can you use like this space for not going 100% to still make things effective and make them useful for people? So I was just talking with Nava about these. So I do a lot of fiber work, a lot of fiber-based work. And so I had an exhibition 2 years ago where I put a bunch of these on an upcycled wooden shelving unit, and told the audience that they were welcome to, like the visitors to the exhibition, they could take these down and play with them in the space. They could throw them to each other, throw them at each other, you know, but like with people's consent, not just beaning random people that come into the exhibition space, but with people's consent, like giving them, you know, like passing it to them. I told people, make sure you have eye contact, don't hurt someone when you throw it. But it also gives people the opportunity, because like people will walk into an exhibition space knowing that they're not supposed to touch something, and they'll be like, like they're looking to see if someone sees them touching it, and they're like, okay, you know, fulfilling that little thing that they feel on the inside. But this gives them the opportunity to actually do it when they walk into a space, to like touch it. Because like I was telling you earlier, like we're socialized on how to be a good audience, no matter where we are. Like if we're at the opera, oh yes, bravo, bravo, right? Or if we're like, you know, at church or something, like, you know, we're quiet and we're thoughtful. Or if we're in an exhibition space, it's like we're not allowed to touch things. So it kind of brings people outside of that and tries to kind of re-socialize them as audience members. It's like, okay, so you're not supposed to touch things over here, but you can touch things over here and you can play with this thing. It's also a way for me to do like icebreakers with folks. Like I do a lot of workshops, a lot of art workshops, and I'll give these to them instead of, you know, and I'll just be like, yeah, for 2 minutes, we're just gonna pass this around. Because then it gets people to look at each other and to recognize who's in the room with them without having to be like, oh, my name is Sally and my favorite ice cream is pistachio, and nobody would know, but I have 20 cats at home, you know? Like usually when we do icebreakers, like they ask us, I mean, they tell us to like answer really weird questions sometimes that can sometimes make people really uncomfortable instead, or it makes us try to put ourselves into a space where we consider ourselves exceptional. It's like, oh, tell us something that we wouldn't guess by looking at you. And it's like, oh, now I gotta think about who I am in society and how other people would view me and how other people are currently judging me. And then based off of that judgment, now I have to tell you what I think you wouldn't guess about me, right? And so it's like, it's a little awkward for some folks. So instead of making them do that, I'll just be like, make sure you have people's eye contact, make sure you have their consent. You know, if they put their hand up, throw it to them, throw it at them, whatever, you know? And so I use these a lot in decompression workshops and just regular workshops, workshop spaces, and in exhibition spaces as well. But I also use them as accessibility tools. So I'm disabled. I'm also chronically ill. I was born that way. Multiple illnesses, like as doctors would say, comorbidities. Sounds really terrible when you say it that way, but it's like, doesn't it? I know, it's like, I know. But yeah, so like I've had to kind of find ways to make my life accessible, like my whole life, you know? And so sitting is something that I love doing. Like when I was a kid, I was diagnosed with something called Osgood-Schlatter's disease, which meant like some of the bones in my knees had like chipped and were in the tendons. Like, yeah, isn't that terrible? Like it was painful. So like whereas other kids were like running around, I was like, I'm gonna sit this one out, guys, thanks. And so a lot of people, you know, they're like, oh, you're young, you can get up, and it's like, no. So I've been thinking about like seating since I was much younger because of that. It's like, yeah, I'm not necessarily a wheelchair user, but I am somebody who does need mobility devices on occasion. And how can I not be standing all the time? Or what can I do, you know, how can I make seating more fun or more thoughtful or whatever? So I actually recently got awarded an Independence Foundation Fellowship for Visual Art to put together an exhibition about seating and about making seating accessible. So I'm in the process of working on several chairs and types of seating, but also a lot of chair-themed objects, which is why you have something like this. It's a coffee table, but it has kind of chairs tumbling down the legs. So it's not done yet. It's still on the way towards being done. But it is a way for me to talk about seating and the importance of seating and how a lot of us, well, not us, but a lot of folks who don't have to think about seating on a regular basis don't often know how difficult it is for those of us who do have to think about seating in every single situation that we're in. to constantly like be thinking like, can I go to this event if there's no chairs, or how many chairs will there be? Or like there was a Christmas event I wanted to go to. One of my friends was doing a concert, and she said, oh, I think that there's chairs, so you should be able to come. You know, you don't have to stand in the back for the 2 hours that we're performing. And I called the venue and I said, oh, do you have chairs? And they said, well, it's first come, first serve. So we advise that you get here an hour before doors open. And yeah, an hour before doors open, and maybe you'll be able to get a seat. And so it's like, okay, so I have to wait outside in a line, standing an hour before doors open to try to get a seat for a show that's gonna be happening an hour later. So it's like often we don't think about the way time and accessibility kind of impact people who like have disabilities and chronic illnesses, and how we could make things a little more easier, or a little easier, not more easier, a little easier by having something as simple as proper seating. So yeah, so my proposal for the Independence Foundation is kind of based around the idea of like seats as a place for joy, but also like as a place to consider other people and to make time for other people, to make space for people. So pretty much everything that's going to be in that presentation when it's finished is either going to be a chair or it's going to be chair themed. And that's currently like what I'm working on. I'm in the middle of making these things, stuff like this, tables and chairs, and lamps that are themed as chairs, and coasters in the shape of chairs to go on coffee tables, but just things like that. So yeah, I don't know.
Where are you working out of?
Currently I'm working out of Next Fab. I'm also doing some work in my art studio.
And does that show you are curated, or you will be making, or the chair is you're curating, or you're making?
Oh, I'm making it. Yeah, I'm making it.
Yeah. Being that you're an independent artist and performer, I think a lot of people would have questions about how do you access support for all of the various projects that you do. Tell us your secret.
I have no secret, I'm crazy. I'm kidding.
Rely on, let's say, foundational or community-focused grants, and then that means that there's a process of like acquiring those grants, which is challenging in and of itself. And are there other ways of support, or?
So I do apply for a lot of grants, and so that tends to support some of my work, and it also helps me to hire assistants to help me with things, or to hire folks who can, like if I'm like, I can't do the social media for this thing right now, can you just do the social media for like the next 3 months? So it looks like I'm posting things and I'll just be over here like, making whatever it is that I have to make. But also like I do a lot of scheduling. Like I like to run a very tight schedule. I mean, life happens, so it's like you can't always plan down to the minute, but I try to. So I was joking the other day with someone that like, how in high school you have like the 8 periods in a day, and it's like, and you schedule your lunches like 45 minutes. So I tend to plan my days almost in that same way, where it's like, okay, when I wake up, I'm going to look for grant applications, or I'm going to finish this grant application that I was working on, but only for the first hour right after I wake up. And then I schedule how I eat, like, when I eat. And then it's like, okay, right after, or not even after eating, maybe before eating, it's like, okay, I'm stretching, or I'm exercising, or I'm doing something to try to like keep things limber and also like not as much pain. And then after that, it's like, okay, well now it's like an hour of music practice, an hour of dance, or an hour of writing things out. So I tend to schedule like every single thing you could think of like into my day, including like rest. I think one of the biggest pieces of advice that someone gave me a few years ago was to learn how to journal my day. And so I was like, I really wish I could remember who it was that gave me that advice, but Should have wrote it down. But they told me they were like, just for an entire week, like write in a journal what you did every half hour of each day for an entire week. And during that time, I realized how much time I was just sitting there, like not doing anything. Or it's like, you eat a bowl of cereal and then you sit there for an hour. Or you're like, oh, I'm going to get around to reading this article. And, you read half of it and then you're on the phone texting someone for like an hour. And you don't realize how much time passes when you're doing that. And so I was able to kind of increase my daily productivity by time journaling. So then it made me like very, very aware of how I use my time and how a lot of people around me use their time as well. So yeah, like almost everything is scheduled. And so that's how I'm able to like apply for grants and I feel like get grants sometimes by doing that. Does that answer the question?
Yes,
Okay.
because I think that was the question that I was about to ask is how do you manage balance creativity and production being a multidisciplinary artist, where you kind of have a lot of things that are being juggled at the same time, but which I could see would be very hard to actually move forward with something.
No, definitely.
So you answered that question, which I asked retroactively.
Yeah, no, I put a lot of value into the idea of like things getting done. So even if it's something small or simple, like I'll, crochet a smaller version of this and be like, okay, that's something done. That's something done. Because I mean, sometimes you don't want to really make something, or you don't want to, you have the time, but you don't have the energy. So I'll make something small to at least fill like the productivity for the day or the week or whatever. Yeah, no problem. I don't know if I trust your question. This is my dad.
Well, I mean, what you just said made me think of something. Now, let's say you have scheduled your day and you're working on a project and you've scheduled a certain amount of time for that project. Okay, have you ever gotten so involved in a project that you've gone over time, okay, and because you've gone over time, you've neglected some other projects?
Yes. But I feel like the biggest thing that I neglect the most, which is like really terrible, is actually self-care. So yeah, like that's probably the thing that I'll eat into the time of the most. I'll be like, oh, I could just eat later. And then it's like 10 p.m. and I'm like, I still haven't had any water today, and it's like, but it's because I'm like trying to make up for any time that I may have gone over time. So it's pretty terrible.
See, now I'm going to have to call you all the time. Did you drink water today? Did you drink your water?
Hydration.
Oh yeah, super important.
So we were talking about grant writing,
Mhm.
and I think that's like one of the biggest questions I always hear from, especially people that are either just trying to figure out how to gain funding for XYZ project. And how did you start, or how did you learn to write a grant?
Sure.
And if you had any support or resources out there.
No, definitely. There's so many. And so, yeah, there's definitely a lot of support and resources. So actually the first time I learned how to write a grant or even research grants, there was like community college has like these like online classes. They aren't necessarily accredited through the community college, but they're more like kind of like workshops or programs online. And there was one by a professional grant writer, and this was 2010 maybe. And so I was like, oh, it was a summer. It was like, I think like every Tuesday in the summer or something. So I decided to take it and just listen to her advice. And every resource that she gave us, I saved to a folder on my computer. And every little thing every article that she sent us, I saved. And I still keep those things now. And so when people ask me, oh, how'd you do this? Like, I'll just send them all of the folders, everything that's in the folder, everything that, all the advice that that woman gave me. But additionally, I was an intern at the Paul Robeson House out in West Philly. And I was working with the founder, and she showed me how to fill out some grants that are in the city. And so that was important to me, like looking at things on a more local scale, where it's like, because there's some grants that you can only get if you're working out of Philadelphia, if you're based in the Philadelphia region. So she definitely helped me kind of open my eyes to that. And then eventually I found out about the Foundation Center. I think that's what it's called, Foundation Center. Yeah, something like that. But they're, an organization, and they have like regional foundation centers. And so there's one actually in the public library here in Philadelphia. And so you can go and you can ask questions and be like, I want to find a grant. How do I find it? And you can sit down with one of the librarians, and they will ask you what project you're trying to fund. They're like, is it for you as an individual? Is it for the organization where you work? And based on how you answer the questions, they'll help you look through their databases. And I would suggest for folks who are trying to find grants and don't know where to start there. To start with the librarian helping you, because it's a free resource, but then also like all the books, like there's shelves after shelves of books on grants and funding. And because there's some small foundations that don't have websites that you can only find through like a book. Or through some listing, or looking on someone else's website and being like, oh, the Who family? Okay, they're funding things. But yeah, that was like the resource center at the library is a huge resource.
I find that interesting that so many people don't even know that exists. And
it's true, yeah.
It's there for all of us.
Exactly.
And it's an amazing resource.
It is.
I'm glad that you've taken advantage of that.
Oh yeah. I go like maybe every year to just see if anything has changed. Because the other thing is like some of the databases that they have on their computer cost too much for an individual to have. Yeah. So you get access to it by being there because the library is paying the fee to have that database. Whereas like an individual, might be like, oh, $2,000 a year for this database, and yeah, no one wants to pay $2,000 a year to look up something like that. So yeah, it's a really good resource. Thoughts, concerns, critiques.
Could you return to talking about your work a little bit and what drives it? Because I'm really interested in this idea of bringing joy, but you've concertedly focused your work on tapping into kind of, this is a very loaded word, domestic practices. And I think that was a conscious decision, but I also imagine that it ties into the pleasure of making things. So could you talk a little bit about that, and then what it means to be doing that in this time?
To be doing work that's like kind of domestic in this time? Is that what you mean?
Well, also aimed at making people giving people a sense of joy and safety, because I think that's a lot of what your work is about.
Absolutely. Honestly, the idea of joy, aside from that woman who I mentioned earlier, who I was very concerned about afterwards, it made me think about like my own experiences. Once again, like going back to this like way of existing in a space as like a participant observer, right? Like using these methodologies within anthropology to be like, oh, okay, so if this is autoethnographic, and if this is like, if this is about me, like how am I feeling in this space? And there's been plenty of exhibitions that I've gone to that I've been like, I've left and been like, oh, that sucked, or I've been like, wow, my feelings are hurt and I can't quite place why. But I think a lot of us have been in spaces like that. And so the idea of bringing joy isn't just necessarily for me to bring it to other people, but it's also so that when I leave, I don't feel terrible too. And so it's like not just a practice in community care, but it's also a practice in self-care too. And being like, I should feel nice at the end of the day when I go home. Like I shouldn't, kind of the way that I felt after I saw that woman cry, I was like, I feel terrible. Like, how can I not do this again? And while I do think that it's important to shed light on issues like that, it's absolutely important to shed light on those things. It's also important to be mindful of how you care for people in the space too. So I'm interested in the way you mentioned domestic earlier.
Yeah,
So.
I mean, I was unfolding a lot of questions in one, I think,
Mm-hmm.
but I think there are a number of ways. So the idea of giving people a positive experience through art, and through sharing of art in certain kinds of spaces is one thing. But you've decided to use craft as a way to do that. So I was hoping you'd talk about that.
Sure. So crocheting and sewing and I guess a lot of craft things that I know, I actually learned from like my mom, my grandmother. My dad actually taught me how to embroider, that he learned from his grandmother. So they aren't just practices and like, something that I learned at like a Saturday workshop. It's like something that not just for several generations of craft workers or people who were like seamsters and seamstresses for other people in the community. So for me, it's also, so a lot of my work is based in like the idea of cultural anthropology, right? And so just kind of looking at my own lineage and like how to celebrate where I come from in multiple ways. How to celebrate like my genealogy or bring it out, but not necessarily be like, this is a family tree, right? Like this is a family tree as well, right? Like I learned how to do this from people who learned how to do it from people who learned how to do it from people. So it's a way for me to also bring my family into the space and to bring what they knew and what they taught me, things that I didn't have to go to school for, and putting it in the context of a Western education that's couched in like Eurocentric ideas, right? Without having to specifically put them into the framework of Eurocentric Western education.
Which then connects to the other thing that I want to get is more about the politics of the domestic in art spaces. Like there's a lot to unpack there.
Oh yeah, there's a whole lot to unpack there. Oh my goodness, there's a lot. Because so for me, as I feel like as a Black person, also as a Latin American person, domestic can mean a lot of things. Because it's not just like, oh, I'm cleaning my own house, but then it's also like, are you cleaning someone else's house? Are you raising someone else's children? Are you, and which I have done. Like I've cleaned houses. That was when I first kind of landed in Philadelphia, I was cleaning houses. At like 19, 20, I was, on my hands and knees scrubbing people's floors and cleaning behind people's toilets because that was the only work that I could find. So it isn't just like a way for me to think about like using domestic things as a mode of empowerment, but also like bringing that thing that in other spaces might be a space of shame, where it's like, yeah, I used to clean, or yeah, I was mending people's clothing while they were at work, stuff like that, which can be a place of shame for a lot of folks, to be like, yeah, I was doing that kind of work, but instead celebrating it and allowing it to be celebrated within me so that I don't have to feel shame around the fact that like I have done domestic work and that I come from people who were enslaved, both in the United States and in Latin America, and indigenous people who were also enslaved, in both spaces too. So yeah, I don't know, does that?
No, yes, absolutely, because that's, I think that's a powerful discussion, especially when you talk about gender and craft and domestic spaces and marginalized populations, and
absolutely.
Domestic can sometimes be a euphemism for unpaid labor.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Or like folk art, right? Like it's like these are the same folks who were like building people's houses and making their tables and chairs for them, and not getting paid for it. Yeah.
So there's a kind of irony there, because on the one hand, you're talking about places where people feel safe. But on the other hand, we're also talking about exploitation.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate it.
Well, I find it interesting because the other side of that is that this has always been the case with craft, is that it's also a powerful tool, and there's nothing more powerful, I think, than people making things.
Definitely.
And so this is something that enters more and more into craft discourse now, and we have maker movement, where people are sort of rejecting the digital environment in which they find themselves, and the lack of physical or haptic engagement with materials, and participating in processes that involve skill and learning, and rediscovering the fulfillment of actually using skills and learning them, acquiring them in order to physically make something. So there are some conflicts there as well, I think, but when you consider the fact that a human being has craft is also iterative. You make something and you get better at it, you make it again, there's a repetition there. So that demands a sense of care. And I think that that's one way to connect with other people, is through the care that you've demonstrated in making an object. So back to your original mission of bringing joy and safety, and creating environments and conversations and experiences in which people feel more invited. I think craft is uniquely the kind of medium that can allow that to happen.
Oh, definitely. I agree. It does make people feel very invited. Yeah.
The domestic is universal too. I think more people, I don't know, who can relate, to, maybe if you walk into a museum, a lot of people, will have to be schooled in order to have a certain understanding. But I think with craft or, I don't know what domestic, I think of domestic as maybe women's work traditionally, but maybe, but that's more universal. I think you people from different walks of life can relate to that. And that's a good thing. I think that's empowering
Definitely.
craft and domestic work.
Oh, definitely.
It's something that I think that everybody is familiar with. I mean, it's objects, it's things that you come in contact with in your home.
They're useful.
Yeah.
They're passed on from generation to generation.
Exactly.
And they're less intimidating. So
Yeah.
you're not afraid to touch.
Yeah.
It's true. Yeah.
And people want to learn, how do you make that? Right?
Exactly,
People
yeah.
ask you about how do you crochet? Who
Yep.
taught you how to crochet?
All the time. It's true.
Well, I think you brought up a very good point that, speaking of, domestic and domesticity, a lot of things that we have equated with women's work, in the domestic arena, has now evolved to artwork, because so few people have those skills anymore. You know what I mean? Like something as simple as a doily. Okay, there was a time when you'd go to someone's home and you'd see doilies all over the place. Now, it's considered artwork because so few people carried that tradition on, and have those skills. So it's amazing to think that something that was once considered a part of grunge work is now elevated to artwork, And I know that a lot of your art, well, like a coffee table, there was a time when you had to build a coffee table because you couldn't buy a coffee table, And then it became, mass produced, right? But now it has been elevated to the form of art because folks like you have taken something mundane and have made it something special. Or have I misspoken?
That's fine. No, it's true. It's true. Yeah. I don't know. I'm just processing it.
Or
Yeah.
it's all a grand experiment conducted by an anthropologist. We're all being observed.
Scary.
Oh, sorry.
So with all your performance art that you do you have any dates coming up that you're going to be?
Nope. I don't have anything on the schedule.
He was very upset about that.
Hope it's okay.
Just keep us up to date. I know that we can follow
Definitely.
you on Instagram and
It's true.
probably see your posts of what you're going to be up to next.
It's true.
You have so many projects going on, so it's always exciting to see what you're going to be doing next.
Oh, that's nice.
So,
Thank you.
I appreciate the energy that you put into everything.
Oh, thanks, Katie.
It makes me feel like I'm not doing enough, so thank you. I need to work harder.
No, don't do that.
Time journaling, I'm actually going to try it and see what happens with that.
Aw.
Oh, question. I'm sorry, were you gonna say?
Oh, no.
What do you like to be called? An artist, a maker, a craft artist, a craft,
Good question.
a craft, I don't know. There's more out there, but
Yeah.
what are you most comfortable with?
I settle on artist. Yeah, because I feel like it just kind of, everything else that I do can just fall into that. Like, I don't have to, be like, oh, I also do performance. And I also, it's just like, no, just art. Just, yeah. Well, thank y'all for having me. I appreciate it. This has been fun. Thank you. Appreciate it.